Hey guys, this is Obsidian Chill. Got another video for you today. And this is part 2 of the video that I released a few days ago, which I'll link in the description in the comment section for what content is missing. I do appreciate everyone's comments. I read them all. I really do appreciate the wide-ranging opinions as well. It really gives me hope and gives the game hope because there's so many people that are still passionate about what the game needs to change in terms to make it better. So this video is going to be focusing on what content is now, what we have, what the content is like in today. So that's why the background footage is just going to be Terraria Elite Plus while I kind of go. So my previous video, if you haven't watched that, you certainly can to kind of get some context, but a lot of it was discussing what raid structure and replayability, everything that we were missing from content previously, like say, for example, Nexus and Paradox brought. There's other examples as well. That was brought up, but it's that content that is mechanically challenging, so it's engaging, and it gives you a sense of replayability because it's not the same thing each time. So kind of fast forward to now. So with the introduction of Flashpoint, which was the Flashtastic Voyage and Flash to the Future, Flashtastic Voyage wasn't included, but Flash to the Future was the first example. We had the Elite raids kind of expanded upon into standard, moderate, substantial, severe, and critical. And when they came out, it was an interesting concept because I'm sure the concept was supposed to be bringing that replayability, giving extra challenges to players without really impacting the rest of the player base. If the player base wanted to just run normal Elite, that's fine. If they wanted to vote as a group to run, a higher level, that was fine too, and you had to unlock it. So the concept itself made sense, but in terms of actual practicality of how it worked out, it was never really something that it lived up to. So for example, with Flash to the Future, nothing really changed that much. So standard, moderate, standard, moderate, substantial, I don't really think any mechanics even changed. The damage obviously would be higher. I know we had the neuro crawlers and like severe and critical. I think some Jack Erics would spawn, but other than that, it was really the exact same instance, just with a little difficulty tweak each time and maybe one or two mechanics added. So that's not all that does is when you have so many levels like that, it just dilutes everything. So I'm not going to run moderate. The same thing it was like with the feats as well. So yeah, the no death feats were nice, but it was like, okay, run standard no death. Okay, now do it again in moderate. Now do it again in substantial. Now do it again in severe. Now do it again in critical. It's just not well thought out. Not to mention all the other bugs that came with it. When we moved to the next one, which was the sixth dimension, that at least because the nice thing about the development team at that point was they did take feedback. So when we moved to sixth dimension, at least we had more mechanics change. So each level, like moderate, substantial, severe, critical, at least had one mechanic added. And then basically it kind of accumulated in critical in terms of like you with the mental distortion, with the players teleporting on the first boss. I wouldn't really call the crystal one-shotting mechanic, but it did become later. You had the Superman ads. At least there were changes. And there's a big difference between the sixth dimension Elite Standard and the sixth dimension, severe and critical. So that was nice. But same thing, a lot of it was diluted because you never ran moderate or substantial. Like, what was the point? You either ran like if you're just doing for a clear, you could run Elite, or if you're just running for like a loot clear for the extra renown or slightly extra difficulty, you ran severe critical. So it just, there was no point to moderate substantial. It just kind of became confusing. So then they moved after that to Source Wall, which we all know. So the Source Wall is the introduction of Elite Plus, which is basically them combining all those extra levels of difficulty into one. And that's where it should be, because you should be able to run Elite, and then if you want, say, that extra challenge, which is kind of how they're passing off as, but all the mechanics are then in one instance. So it's not like you're slowly, gradually building up to that. You have the base, event and regular, and then you have Elite, and then basically then Elite Plus feels like a new experience because you're not used to necessarily all the mechanics that were in Elite because they weren't there. So with like severe and substantial, as you move up the levels, it really is the exact same. So Elite Plus at least had some hope. And then when Source Wall came out, I know Source Wall is going to be how everyone uses it as a basis of comparison, because it was the first Elite Plus raid, and it was definitely the hardest raid we've had in a very long time. Probably, in my opinion, the hardest raid since Darkside War Factory came out. You could argue Sixth Dimension Elite did present some challenges, or I should say Sixth Dimension Critical presented some challenges, but Source Wall Elite Plus was a whole new thing, but it wasn't for the reason players thought it was. So Source Wall Elite Plus was not tuned from test server. I mean, I don't think it was tuned at all. So when it released, you had just like basic weapon taps from the bosses doing like 500-600k damage. I mean, it wasn't even like practical to complete that raid. It wasn't even practical to beat that raid. It was basically the race to see who could beat like second boss, because it took like, I would say I could be wrong. Someone could correct me in the comment section. I believe it was a week before even first boss was beat in Source Wall Elite Plus, and the second boss was still a lot of people focusing on that. There was a lot of streams, so raid is difficult or a bit overtuned when it was basically survival mode. How Source Wall was structured was not entirely inducive to an actual raid instance, because you required so many extra tanks because of how the bosses are structured. So if you have all these mini bosses, if you tune them up to Elite Plus difficulty, obviously they're going to be just as hard as like regular Elite bosses. So then you can't manage just like two tanks on one tank for two bosses, because that tank's just going to get destroyed. And then Source Wall, I mean, this is the same thing. It's being opinion, but really Source Wall wasn't so much like, yes, it showed supreme like tanking. I would say ingenuity, that's the wrong word, but basically tank skill, but a lot of it was just roll dodging, so you could roll dodge your way through it. Yes, there's a skill factor to that, but it's not the tanking. I'm biased because it's not the tanking that I'm used to. Like back in the day, I'd much rather face tank, but you can't face tank because you get destroyed, so then you can't really kite, because then you're going to run into other tanks and get them killed, or the boss mechanic's going to face the group and kill them. So you can't kite, you can't face tank, you basically just have to keep roll dodging back and forth to dodge all their attacks and not take damage. And like I said, that there's definitely 100% a skill factor to that. Some tanks are great at that, some tanks struggle at that. That's just not my cup of tea for tanking. But we moved from Source Wall, so I mean, on the forums, all the talk about like removing Elite Plus difficulty altogether. I'm not trying to have this commentary turn into like an Elite Plus discussion or difficult discussion, because it's not. It's just basically just this is what we have. So then we moved from Source Wall to Rock of Eternity and Neuron's Underworld. Neuron's Underworld Elite Plus I don't have as much experience with. I just wasn't able to get in groups, or it's just like friends list and pub runs. I wasn't really in the league at that point, so I can't really speak to Neuron's Underworld Elite Plus. Rock of Eternity was really still straightforward. I mean, yeah, they had presented options to die, but it was a short raid. So, and then we move into what we have now with Terrarium Elite Plus, and this is kind of, we seem to be working backwards. So we have Source Wall Elite Plus come out. Perfect example of a difficulty raid, and should stay. But then we move backwards kind of with Rock of Eternity and Neuron's Underworld, then we move backwards again with Terrarium Plus. With Terrarium Elite Plus, there's like two mechanic changes. So the first boss, where you have to separate rock and static because they buff each other, you would do that anyway to complete the raid, because one's got the reflect shield, you got to alternate, so you're not going to be tanking them together anyway. And there's even a feat for like not enraging them. You get that feat just by doing the raid normally. You actually get I think you get every single feat besides the 32 add feat by just completing the instance regularly. So like, you don't want to touch each other with the Sorcery Aura to lose power. Okay, just don't touch each other. Boom, that's a feat. I mean, don't separate the bosses. Boom, that's a feat. Don't miss the eggs, because you're gonna wipe if you miss the cog timers on the orbs or the eggs anyway. That's a feat too. So really, I find it ironic that people are complaining on the forum saying they want to remove feats from Elite Plus, but all the feats are so unimaginative that you just get them naturally just by playing the content. And really, the only mechanic changes were like the Sorcery Aura. You had an extra cog that came up on the final boss. A few other changes, like some extra damage tweaks. That's about it. So we keep moving backwards in content where there's absolutely no replayability with Terrarium Elite Plus, and we didn't even get an Elite Plus alert, because I mean this alert was just complete garbage. Like the MCTE was just absolute garbage example of an alert. And I thankfully the developers must have realized that, and that's why they didn't even attempt to make that Elite Plus. They're like, no, this is not going to work. So I feel like we're really moving backwards. And I understand it's not completely on the game's fault. I know they have a smaller development team, and I point that out all the time. But what I don't understand is that you guys saw my previous video and showing Nexus and Paradox. DC has been around for 12 years, so they've got a plethora of content mechanics to pull from that are proven. So they know it worked. They know it worked even with Elite difficulty. So when you go back to Nexus and Paradox, like my previous commentary, Nexus and Paradox didn't have an Elite raid. It was just the normal raid. So just imagine doing that Elite, or doing like Nexus Elite, or doing pulling mechanics. Like there's so many examples they can use. And I understand there could be some like legacy code challenges. Like I'm not a developer, so I can't speak to that. But I just know that there's so much recycled for content for mechanics, like the infectious ire, which is basically that red target symbol where you have to spread out. I mean, we've had that recycled so many times. I know it's the same developer doing it, so it's like, I think we need a hard mechanic. Let me just put the infectious ire and copy and paste. So it's really, they need to pull from so many examples of older content to actually make it engaging. And I'm not saying that Elite Plus needs to be overwhelmingly difficult like Source Wall, because that's not going to necessarily drive replayability or drive players back to the game. It's certainly going to drive some. We need something that is just mechanically engaging and has high replayability. So if a Elite raid, what I've always said, like say if I was the developer, I would work backwards. So I would make a raid with a lot of mechanics, with a lot of mechanics playing off each other, with a high difficulty, mechanically engaging content. I would put everything in the kitchen sink into a raid, and then basically strip that away as you go through the content. So okay, so this is going to be Elite Plus. For Elite, I'm going to deactivate 3 mechanics or these 3. And then for regular, I'm going to tone them all down, remove some of these ones, and then event, I'm just going to remove them all. But that's not what they do. They do the other way. So they start with like regular content, and then how are we going to make this into Elite? How are we going to make this into Elite Plus? That is completely backwards thinking, and it doesn't make any sense. Then you're grasping at straws, trying to make up mechanics, ask for people in the forums like how to make this difficult, or what mechanics we should add. I remember I even stated in the forum saying like it should be like Clock Tower and the boss just in rage, but that was just an example of early design. So I didn't know how that was going to work out and play out. That was just a thought. And because the room is so huge and the bosses don't try to get near each other, so at least with Clock Tower, you had Catwoman kind of lunging out. You had the bosses trying to get close to each other, so the tanks had to make sure they were always separated and get close to each other. That's not the case with Static and Rocket. They stayed, the hell away from each other. So that's what content is missing. It's this engaging replayability that people want to play the content. When they're playing the content, they're going to get gradually better. Then when they gradually get better at running regular, then they're going to try Elite. Then they're going to get gradually better running Elite because they enjoy running the incidents. And then they're going to want continually higher difficulty because it's like, okay, I like this. Let me try Elite Plus out. And then we get more people enjoying Elite Plus, and then they can slowly ramp up that difficulty, something like Source Wall, or have other instances come back. So it's a lot of the decisions that I don't understand because they're just, the developers are making it harder on themselves. And I completely trust and have faith in Quitoxic, which is pretty much the only developer left from the beginning. He's done like Nexus, he's done Darkseid War Factory. I mean, he did the Source Wall. He's got a complete resume with DC. So I'm not sure if it's just his thought process that needs to be changed, or it's the actual design process because they don't have a creative director or anything like that. But that's how I would do it. Like, you really need to design raids from the top down rather than the bottom up. So that's what I hope for the future for DC. I hope we get to a point where we have content that players actually want to run, and it's not just mindless content. That's what Terrarium Elite Plus is. I mean, I know DPS are trying to comp with it and have fun with that, and try to have fun with it, because you can't run old content all the time, because you can't just, okay, Terrarium Elite Plus sucks, I'm going to go back to Rock of Eternity. You've already run Rock of Eternity, for multiple months, so that you can't go back to that because it's just completely boring. You need to have something that's always going to be engaging. So even if it's something like where a raid comes out and they add mechanics, like say there's always like halfway through the cycle where they add those extra rewards, they could add extra feats too, something to change the raid so it's a new experience. So I think I've kind of rambled on enough. You guys kind of get my point. But really, there's so much potential for DC still, even after all these years. They just have to go back to what they were doing before, because really there's a small percentage of the player base that even remembers or recalls what the past was in this game, and that's the developers' advantage. I know obviously there's not many developers in the beginning, but I mean they can run back. They've got access to all the old content. They can see what it was like. So I really don't think there'd be any kind of issue if they just copy and pasted older mechanics and then just added that to newer raids. The player base needs, at least the content player base. So like I said before in the previous video, the artistic side, the cosplay side, the styles, all the rewards, booster bundles, resurgence, mega capsules, all that's covered, and really that's excelling on the game. The new addition of emotes. But what's struggling and what needs to change is the content side of this game. And I believe that's what's, if it's going to be a game that people want to play and bring back old players, or expand upon that player base, you can't just rely on styles. That's just basically sitting around the watchtower or sitting in your base in your lair. You need the actual content side. So take care, guys. We'll see you in the next video. And once again, leave your comments in the description as well. In the comment section. I always appreciate reading them as well. Appreciate you guys.